On to our last panel. So if you haven't heard Jason or Isaac speak before, you are in for a treat. I've heard Isaac deliver several of his presentations, and I'm always just enraptured by the information he has. Jason, I heard for the first time last year for the April organizing. We were both speakers, and I remember sitting there on Zoom, listening to Jason and thinking, how did I never think of this before? How is this so important and yet something, I mean, I'd heard about, institutional debt, student debt, but the connections that Jason makes to institutional debt and other forms of obedience and disciplinary actions was just mind-blowing too. So I both, you all feel the same way. You are in for a treat. Let me introduce sample. Who's going first? You go.
Yeah.
All right. Isaac Kamola is a professor of political science at Trinity College, Hartford. He is author Precies and money manufacturing at campus Herkeyor. And he making, sorry, I'm not distributing on my phone and my eyesight said it worse. Many the world global U.S. universities and the production of the global imaginary. He is currently the director of a Mellon-funded Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom at the American Association of University Professors. Jason Wozniak is Associate Professor and Coordinator of Transformative Education and Social Change Program at Westchester University. He is a researcher and organizer with Debt Collective and founder and co-director of the Latin American Philosophy of Education Society. Jason writes on education debt of all types and is co-author of Lend and Rule, which if you had not had a chance to look at, I highly recommend taking a look at it. Just amazing stuff. So you are in for a treat. Welcome. I'm going to turn it over.
Great.
I'll give you a 20-minute.
Please. Thanks so much. Thanks, Afshan. Thanks to all the organizers of the conference. It's really great, especially the Wesleyan crew that's been here. I'd like to thank all the speakers and presenters that have also presented. Whenever I'm in a room with Jill Morawski, I have to do a shout out to Jill because she hired me as I was an unemployed graduate student. And I had a postdoc at CHUM at the Center for the Humanities that was kind of saved my young career. I don't know where I would be if Jill didn't take a flyer on me back then. So you're the best, Jill. So I have a presentation that I do. I study dark money in higher education and the right-wing libertarian think tanks that fund the infrastructure that's largely responsible for the attack on higher education. My general premise is if you take away these right-wing donors and if you take away the institutions that they've built, then we have a very different political landscape, both in higher education and in politics, global and U.S. politics. And so I think it's really important to name the money and to identify and to research the money. So basically, but I'm going to kind of preface my talk that I usually give kind of with just a little bit of the conversations that have happened today in terms of thinking about organizing and strategy. And I can't believe it that I just want to go back to that moment in 2011 with the Occupy movement, right? And the We Are the 99%, right? And just how powerful and important that calling was, and how that moment in which a certain kind of neoliberal capitalism seemed inevitable, and then you had this challenge. And it was whatever. We can say what we will about Occupy, but I think in terms of changing a certain type of discourse and certain kind of horizon of imagination was absolutely important. What we didn't predict is that horizon of imagination would then be captured by the fascists, right? But I think that is really the thing that I take about that We Are the 99% is that it really names this kind of us versus them politics. And I think that as we're thinking about what kind of politics we move forward with out of this room, I'm going to make an argument that researching the money and the financing of higher education and the dark money, these are people with names, these are organizations, these are entities that we can name and shame, but also organize against, that this should be an important part of our strategy. Not the only part of our strategy, but an important part of the strategy of a clarifying of kind of who are the people and the organizations that are making higher education unlivable, right? I think that there's a way in which we can theorize it. We can name an abstraction like neoliberalism or even like capitalism. And as a good Marxist, I'm not going to say that capitalism is an abstraction, but that we can think about kind of like there's a ways in which we can talk about capitalism, right, in ways that are highly abstracted, or we could talk about it in ways that are personified. And so what I'm trying to do with my research is tell the stories about a structure of capitalism that personifies and names who an enemy is. So basically, what I want to do is just kind of quickly, now that I've used up a good chunk of my time, kind of prefacing this quickly. No. I don't. I don't want extra time. But okay, so what I want to do is just give an overview. I wrote a report for the American Association of University Professors. I direct the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom, which is kind of a Mellon-funded project at the AAUP that's doing a research and is working with partner organizations and developing resources to kind of think about the evolving threats to academic freedom. And one of the first things I did in that capacity was write this white paper called Manufacturing Backlash. And it looks at the kind of, and so what I'll quickly do is kind of give an overview of some of the findings from that report to kind of give an example of what it looks like to kind of name the entities that we're up against. And then what I want to do is close by some reflections on how we might use this kind of analysis in our future organizing. So the Manufacturing Backlash report looked at the 2021, 2022, 2023 legislative sessions, and it identifies 4 different types of legislation. It looked at right after 2020. I remember that the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, that summer, were the largest protests in American history, right? There was 6 to 10% of the adult population attended a Black Lives Matter protest. There's Black Lives Matter protests in 40% of the counties across the United States, including many that are primarily white and primarily rural. It was a massive protest and event, and the reporting that's been done on the text messages and communications among the plutocratic billionaire class, a lot of them demonstrate that people were freaking out in this donor class, right? They were realizing that when my grandma starts talking about structural racism, then their justifications for their obscene wealth cannot hold, right? If people understand that one's wealth and livelihood and lifespan is determined by the ways in which racial inequality is made hierarchy, then those ideas about pull yourself up by your bootstraps and all that stuff, it makes absolutely no sense. This was an existential threat to both their political power, but also the ideological power that they had spent on decades producing. So you might remember this moment where in everybody, like Black Lives Matter, and then in September, the end of September, early October, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there was this hand ringing about critical race theory. Like, oh my God, critical race theory is destroying America, is destroying higher education, right? And then in the 2021 legislative session, which was the first legislative session after that summer of protest, there was the first round of what became known as divisive concept bills or anti-CRT bills, right? And so what I do in the Manufacturing Backlash report is I look at those academic gag orders and identify between those 3 years, the 99 that were introduced and 10 that were passed. And then that attack on CRT kind of evolved into an attack on DEI as those CRT bills got challenged in court as violations of free speech, right? Because saying, professor, you can't teach this in your class like the Stop Woke Act did in Florida, that gets stalled in the Supreme Court. And so there's actual debates within the right-wing ecosystem about how the goal is not to censor speech, but is to instead fundamentally change institutions to make sure those classes that would teach that content are not around to teach that content, right? And that becomes a much harder constitutional issue if you are preventing certain types of classes from being taught rather than censoring what people are saying in already existing classes, right? So that shift to DEI then became, there was kind of a lag where there was no DEI bills in 2021 and 2022 at the state level, and there was a flood of them in 2023, and we've only seen that line of attack accelerate in the last year and a half since this report, kind of the period that's covered in this report. And then I also look at efforts to weaken tenure, and arguing that the attacks on tenure then makes higher educations more vulnerable to these right-wing attacks, right? And increases the power that political actors have on influencing what goes on college campuses. Recognizing, of course, that the vast majority of teachers and professors already work off the tenure and tenure track. And so that making that the already largely contingent workforce even more contingent, right? And then also these attacks on accreditation, which were efforts to basically that started in Florida, where DeSantis was being criticized by an accrediting agency because he imposed a crony, like a political ally, to the president of a university without oversight. And the accrediting agency was like, that seems a little dodgy. That may be an issue for accrediting. And then he went and retaliated, and there was a number of states that introduced bills weakening accrediting standards. And then there's a fifth type of bill that I look at, and those were the kinds of bills that really get at the governance of institutions. So these include those kinds of bills that establish legislature-created schools, like in North Carolina and Florida and Texas and elsewhere, where the state legislature creates that we don't like what's being taught in the history department, so we'll create a school of civics, or we'll create the Hamilton Center. We'll create these entities to teach the kinds of things that we would prefer to be taught, and that won't go through the system of shared governance, right? So instead of the faculty determining the curriculum, it'll be the director, and the director is appointed by the president, right? And so it's a way of kind of getting into the curriculum itself and fundamentally remaking its curriculum. So we look at these 5 kinds of legislation. We identify a number of states where these deep overlapping bills are introduced that mutually reinforce each other. So, for example, in Florida, the Divisive Concept Bill, which is a Stop Woke Act, even though that was held up in court, that definition is still used in the DEI bill as justification for why we have to end DEI, because there's these certain kinds of divisive concepts. See this definition of divisive concept, for example. So there's a number of states, especially Florida and North Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas, that had this series of kind of overlapping and interlocking bills. In this last legislative session, in the past legislative session, there's been also an intensification in a number of other states. Iowa, Nebraska, other states are just getting the same types of bills, attacks on tenure that then also attack DEI, et cetera. So what we do in the report is we identify 11 major think tanks that were largely responsible for pushing, or that kept as I was reading the secondary sources and the testimony, who's showing up to testify, who is writing about this in their spaces, and who's publishing on these particular issues, it became the same handful of people, right? And it was largely like there's more groups than this, but there's these particular groups, and there's the national level think tanks, the Heritage Foundation, Manhattan Institute, but also state level think tanks, and these are just a few of them. The Idaho Freedom Foundation and the Texas Public Policy Foundation were just 2 groups that were particularly active on the issue of DEI in particular. And then there's a number of what's called kind of like specialty organizations, right? And so like the American Council for Trustees and Alumna, what they do is they focus on training trustees in the argument and analysis and justification that what they should be doing is running the university, not those meddlesome faculty, right? To basically say faculty only get in the way, and it's actually the trustees that are appointed by the governor. So that's the democratic vehicle for running a university. And so it's trustees that should be responsible for determining the curriculum, for hiring faculty, for firing faculty, right? And so that is like one of the things that ACTA does, is promote that idea and justification. If you're interested, the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom just published a great report by Nancy McLean that goes into great detail on ACTA and kind of examines who they are, who's behind them, who funds them, et cetera. Okay. Now, it also turns out that this kind of universe of folks is funded by the same group of donors. So if you've read Jane Mayer's Dark Money, the first half of this will look like kind of like the who's who of kind of right-wing donors that Jane Mayer covers. So you have Bradley, Donors Trust, Scafie, Serral, Freedom, and you have the 85 Foundation. That's Leonard Leo's outfit. He's the guy who got $1.6 billion with the B from Barry Said to basically fund the Federalist Society and other efforts to push the courts, but also American politics in general, further to the right on a kind of nationalist direction. There's the Walton Family Foundation. That's Walmart. The Pope Foundation is the kind of like the North Carolina kind of Koch brother network, kind of in North Carolina in particular. So that these organizations don't just share the same group of donors, they're also deeply connected together with this group that's called the State Policy Network. And the State Policy Network is kind of a think tank of think tanks that kind of brings together those national level think tanks like Heritage and the Manhattan Institute to work with the state level think tanks to make sure that they're working on the same kind of set of marching orders, right? And this is Hurdle Fernandez wrote a great book called State Capture. I forgot his first name. Why did I forget his name? So I'm just going to call him by his last name. Hurdle Fernandez. It's a fantastic book. And basically examining, he calls it part of the troika of the Koch funded network, right? Where you have the State Policy Network is kind of bringing this density together in the think tank world to make sure that the talking points, reports, white papers, model legislation that's being created at the national level is being advocated for at the state level as well. And then it also turns out that a lot of these same organizations are also on the board of Project 2025. When I published this, nobody knew who Project 2025 was, and now that's the world that we live in, is basically a word for word. If you want to know what they're going to do to the Department of Education in their next in the executive order on accreditation, you could just read the Project 2025. But you can see that the moral of the story is that there's this group of networks of think tanks that are not only funded by the same folks, but they're also deeply connected in other ways and working closely together. So what does this look like in practice? I'll just give two examples. I think there's two examples, maybe one example. I took out the other example, so I'll give you one example. That the Chronicle of Higher Education in 2023 laid out the different kinds of model bills or the different types of bills that were attacking DEI. And they identified a whole bunch of different bills, including bills that closed DEI offices, bills that stopped mandatory training of DEI, bills that stopped diversity requirements, and also statements in hiring, diversity statements. That at the same time that these bills were introduced, again, this was 2023 that a lot of these bills were introduced, you had a series of reports that were being produced by this guy named Scott Yenner, who was a Boise State political science professor, raging misogynist, and who was also a member of the Idaho Freedom Foundation. He was a fellow there and a fellow at the Claremont Institute, as well as affiliated with a number of other think tanks. And they wrote this kind of collaboration of folks kind of authored a whole bunch of different articles and reports laying out DEI and going campus by campus saying, what does DEI look like at Texas A&M, or what does it look like at these particular in the North Carolina system? They created this crazy hysterical response about what DEI is, this kind of fever dream machination of what DEI looks like on college campuses. And this was all in response to a conversation that he was having with the funder of the Claremont Institute, Thomas Klingenstein, was basically they were having this email or this text thread back and forth in which Klingenstein says, we are getting absolutely murdered, and Scott Yenner responds, you know what we have to do is we have to take the term diversity and turn it toxic, right? So he took that idea as, okay, we have to take this thing, create a bunch of disinformation about what it is, right? Create this term toxic, strategically pollute what this term means, right? And then the result was these reports that were published. There's more than 15 or so of them on the website that are kind of co-authored by all these folks in these in these think tanks looking at higher education, K-12, but also in this like crazy understanding of what diversity stuff is. They call it like, and then goes by campus and says, look, they spent this much on this center and this much on this program and this much on this speaker series and this much on this. And then when states were actually debating the bills in Tennessee and in Texas, the reporting has revealed that a lot of the legislators were influenced by these kinds of reports, right? Well, it also turns out that Christopher Rufo, our buddy, and a bunch of folks at the Manhattan Institute, as well as Matt Beidenberg at Goldwater. Goldwater is the state level think tank that out of Arizona. They wrote this model legislation that included four different ways that you could abolish DEI, which is exactly the same four that that the Chronicle identified in its kind of analysis of the bills, right? And basically, states were cut and pasting these types of bills. And so, what did this look like in Texas when they passed Senate Bill 7, ending DEI? There was hundreds of people who came out to testify against it. Students, faculty, professionals on college campuses, citizens of all kinds. Hundreds of people came out to testify, submitted written testimony, right? And the people who came out to advocate in favor of it was about 6 folks, right? And they included Richard Johnson of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, Adam Kissel of the Heritage Foundation, who then had a fellowship at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, Sherry Sylvester at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and Ben Carson, yes, that Ben Carson, Magic Hands, who had also created his own minor and insignificant think tank as well. So basically, and then if you look at Sherry Sylvester, she's there in the fuchsia thing. If you look at her report, her testimony, and you look at what she's citing, what she is citing is all of these reports that were produced by Yenner and produced by Heritage, produced by Manhattan, just like this laundry list, creating this ecosystem of evidence and analysis that then gets used in testimony. So I'll give you just one quick a second example. So this is to kind of like, this was after the report was written, but this is the Dear Colleague a letter which basically applies Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard, right? So the bill, the Supreme Court decision that kind of bans affirmative action, and basically applies that decision to all kinds of campus diversity work, right, and other kinds of practices on college campuses. There's a tendency to just say, "Oh man, the Supreme Court, they made this really terrible decision," but if you have an analysis in which you start by following the money, you can see that that Students for Fair Admission was actually an organization that was created by Edward Blum. Edward Blum is somebody who has been the head of 2 advocacy groups of the Project for Fair Representation and Students for Fair Admissions that have received money from the same group that I showed on that slide before. Cyril Freedom, Scafie, Bradley, Donors Trust, which is the donor money kind of pass through entity, created these advocacy groups that I think that we can use this language here, that groomed all of the plaintiffs in that hearing, right, and identified them and trained them and paid them, and then if you look at the amicus briefs that were written in support of Students for Fair Admission, a lot of them were also written by groups that were funded by the similar donor network, and then that case was heard before a Supreme Court where the majority was handpicked by the Federalist Society, and the Federalist Society itself was funded by exactly the same donors, right? So you basically have this like snout to tail, right? This definitive transformation in American higher education that gets used to enact and justify incredible harm on our college campuses that's being paid for by this handful of plutocratic billionaires and dictators. And so I think that that's not the whole story, of course. That's a simplified version of the story. There's a whole other, like we can go on and make that story much more complicated. But I think it's helpful to tell a kind of clear, crisp story. Um, so what does this mean for our campus organizing? First of all, I think that we can take a look at our board of trustees, our donors, as well as those centers that may be on our college campuses, and identify and map the money, right? And to be very clear about who it is that's governing our institutions and what kind of financial interests that they have. Maybe it won't be the same group of donors. Maybe it's somebody else. Maybe it's somebody worse, right? Or maybe it's more complicated than that, which is probably the case, right? But then I think that it becomes really important to really understand how the money is functioning on our own campuses, as well as at the federal level, but also on our own campuses. And then to use that as something that becomes a foundation, what Hamilton Nolan said kind of at the beginning in the opening comments about a campaign for the common good that really is able to frame. Here are the individuals that are governing the institution in this particular way with these very particular concrete interests, and here's what they have in mind, and here's what they're trying to pursue, right? And here's the 99% of us that are opposed to that vision, right? And not only that, in advocating against these boards of trustees, these governors, these donors, that we are actually going to advocate a broad vision of what higher education could be and use our organizing power to reduce tuition, to expand access, and to create a different kind of higher education system that's not beholden to those moneyed interests. Okay, I think I'm done. Thanks.
Can I switch off the slide?
Oh, sorry.
Isaac, it's a pleasure to be on the table for the panel with you. I've learned a ton from you. I teach your courses. And Afshan, you equally blew my mind that day we met during the conversation, but also afterwards in conversations that we were able to have along the lines of some of the things that I'll be talking about today. Is that okay? Okay. I also want to say that people are in the streets today. My mom's in the streets today for the first time. So I'm like, fuck yeah.
Okay.
Right. Like Harry Cleaver, the autonomous Marxist, always reminds us that we have to take stock of our power before anything. If we're always just reacting to, as if they're directing the ship all the time and we're just reacting, that's not the way it is. They're reacting to us. And I think, Isaac, your work shows that. Like, in a lot of ways, the what's going on is a counter-revolution to advances that we've been making. And I don't want to paint too rosy of a picture. Trust me, the rest is going to be depressing, but yay. But I do think it's important to take stock of the power in the room, the power in the streets, the power that we have. And if we fight, we win. So I'm going to talk about institutional debt. And I am glad that I'm able to speak after Isaac or alongside, because I think it adds another layer to this analysis of who governs the university. And as Afshan mentioned, part of the big claim is that we are governed by debt. And that I will overdetermine that right now just to make the point, but debt and credit have an enormous influence over our personal lives, our subjectivity, how we live, our behavior, but also our institutions like higher education. And my point today is to try and show that. Now, admittedly, this is all in this Lendon rule book, and I'm only doing really part one of the book, which is the analysis part. There is a whole other conversation we need to have about what do we do. And maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A, but it would take too long to do everything at once. And I think it's hard to talk about what to do if we don't really know what we're up against. So I'm really just trying to map out a little bit of this framework of a debt economy and what it means to have a university in the debt economy, and then try and make this intelligible for us and others as we seek to form different forms of resistance. So to do that, I want to start off just with some general numbers about how institutional debt, and when I say institutional debt, I'm referring to the debt that our universities have. So how does institutional debt affect us? This is just a couple examples. Roughly speaking, 4 to 5% of university budgets every year go to debt. Sometimes it's higher. At the University of Colorado, for example, annual debt service, around $7,000 per undergrad, is sufficient to hire and maintain 2,700 tenure-track faculty, or reduce tuition by thousands of dollars. At CUNY in New York, CUNY spends more on debt than on academic support, and actually used federal CARES money to pay off private dorm debt. Anytime we read these numbers, we need to think in the terms of extraction and accumulation. This is money that's being extracted from the public good or from the university good and accumulated by private interests. And Abby Boggs back there and other folks in abolitionist university studies have done an enormous service for us in tracking the history of the university as a site of capitalist accumulation. So thank you. Like, really drawn on your work a lot. I want to ground this a little bit. I'm not an expert in Connecticut, but I did do a quick search. This took like 5 minutes, so if there's errors. This is in the annual report that anyone can look up online, and what I was looking for was debt. And if you hear it, this is actually a tactical tip. First thing, downline your budget and use the magical Control F. And put the word debt in there. In your University of Connecticut, UConn, it showed up 123 times. I didn't have time to read all 123. But one thing that you do find very quickly are these really helpful charts. And in one of the charts, you see state. So first off, UConn's debt is tied to the state, the state of Connecticut. This is important for you all here to try and figure this out, how that changes politics. But one of the things it shows is that the state debt service commitment last year was $77 million. Now, I want to point out, I am a Marxist, that interest is money making money. Like, there is no work going into that. That is just pure profit. All the way back to Aristotle and religion, they'd be like, that shit's immoral. When no one's doing any work, they're taking $77 million that could be going. I mean, you tell me, what could $77 million do for UConn? A lot. That's only an interest. That's not even the principal. I think the principal at total UConn debt is at $2 billion. It's a lot of money. This is just a chart that I found really wild because the colors helped me. But look at the long-term debt and bonds payable. If you look at the percentage of that pie chart there, like, that's huge. That's just nuts. Like, that just shows you right there how much this is weighing. And I would argue that when we see headlines like this, what I would encourage folks to do is to ask the question, how much of this is because of austerity forced by debt and credit? I think we absolutely, if we're going to sharpen our knives, have to figure out a way to fight back against the mechanisms, or broadly speaking, the debt economy, the debt state that I'll be talking a little bit more about. And this is a real big challenge, I think. I don't think labor in general has figured out how to organize in and against financial capital. Debt collected, the group that I work with, we do have some ideas about this, but we don't have a base. So this is like, we need to figure out how to work together about this. Now, what I'm also, my friend Delaney Shermer always says, once you put the debt goggles on, you can't take them off. And you see everything through the lens of debt. And so really what's happening for me is I keep analyzing the current conjuncture through the lens of debt and credit. And I know everyone says neoliberalism's dead and all this other stuff. I'm not so sure. And I want to show a couple things here. This is wild. This came out the other day. So the Trump administration is punishing the elites, right? And they're taking away these funds. Okay, so what's the response to the elites? They're rushing to the bond market. Meaning they are trying to get as many loans as possible. Princeton is just one example. It's not a loan. Elite colleges in Trump crosshairs rush to the bond market at record pace. So just to quote, America's most prestigious colleges are rushing to the debt market at the fastest pace on record. locking in financing while they can to pay for campus projects or refinance debt against the backdrop of tax and funding threats. Because remember, one of the other plans of the Trump administration is to start taxing endowments. I'm not saying that, like, we should talk about that. Like, is that strategic and should we use that strategy to our own benefit?
Yeah.
What I'm really interested in, though, and this is mainly a piece about the Ivy Leagues and like Stanford and this other stuff, but I think it's safe to say that eventually this is going to make its way down to the publics as well. When the funding starts to dry up for the publics, will the publics also be rushing to and or force into the bond market at a pace that we've not seen before, which is already high? And once it does, I think that as the higher education funding decreases and more universities turn to debt financing, Trump and his team accomplish at least 3 goals at once when they're gutting funding. By driving universities into further debt, they are expanding financial capitalist markets and profit. This is really important, right? They are creating markets for someone. It's not up. They're accelerating and intensifying privatization of public higher education. And as I'll show, I don't think we can make a legitimate case for shared governance as long as we're as massively indebted as we are. And in fact, I would say that the board of trustees are more of a symptom, and I'll talk about why. And they're not the ultimate target if we look at this ways that credit rating agencies look at. But this is really complicated. I'm not saying we shouldn't attack them and we shouldn't get rid of them. We should. But not attack for those watching. I don't mean violence. But like, no, man, the other day the police showed in front of my house and like sat there for an hour. But so the other thing that they're using, this is a big part of what I want to talk about, was that I think the folks in power realize how this works. That you can use debt and credit to discipline people and to discipline universities. This was used very well after the 1960s and 70s against the student movements. And I would also argue one of the reasons why it's so hard for our students to participate in struggles. And in fact, the data shows, I can quote it later, I can't find it right now, but the data shows that indebted workers are less likely to engage in strike activities and or political work. Why? Everyone knows why. You go on strike, you lose your job, and you get disciplined, you get a felony, you get arrested, you lose time at work, you're done for. You don't only, you not only lose your job, but you have all these debts that you have to pay. And power realizes this. This is as old as, this is post-slavery. Sadia Hartman talks perfectly about it. Like, who's going to do the work? Well, we got a way to guarantee work, drive freed slaves into debt. That guarantees a workforce that's docile and disciplined, her words. So like, this is an old strategy, and I think we need to be aware of the ways in which they are permanently trying to drive us deeper into debt in order to discipline and control what we do or don't do. I think it helps to situate, and I should have said this earlier, but we see like massive amounts of the growth of university debt to the point now where it's around $300 or so billion. That's across the country. Now, on one hand, this seems like a lot. On the other hand, if you look at like in an ideal world, and in fact, this was written into the latest College for All bill that I helped write, we said that this debt should be canceled, like at some point, not now, but one thing as a utopian goal would be like the government buys or someone buys, we figure that out and cancels all this debt to give universities a clean slate. That's another conversation we can have later. But the point being is that, okay, this seems like a lot, and for a larger public project, it's not that much, but $300 billion has a really strong force in governing. And I think one of the key questions here is, like, where does this come from? Like, how has this been developed over time? And I think what it helps to do is to consider with Wolfgang Streeck what he calls a shift from the tax state to the debt state. And so basically the long and the short of this, and this is in Wolfgang Streeck's Buying Time, is that tax states are when public goods or programs are paid for via taxes on the wealthy and corporation. A debt state is when those services and goods are financed through debt. And what happens is, and we're all aware of this, beginning with Ronald Reagan, especially, the tax rate goes from 90% in the 1940s all the way down to whatever it is today, 37% or something like that. But really with Reagan and the cuts, you start to see this formulation, and I had some charts we can look at later. But point being is that when the tax cuts are so deep and profound, and they're based on tax revolts, you lack necessary revenue to fund the public goods that you need. It has both an impact on public institutions, but obviously individuals as well, because as our social welfare net is taken away, as we say at Debt Collective, we're not in debt because we live beyond our means. We're in debt because it's the only means to live. And we all know people that are struggling. Myself, I have $240,000 in student loans. But the point being is that we don't have a spending problem that demands austerity. We have a revenue problem that drives universities and people into debt. Sandy Bryan Hager offers a useful summary of the financial transition from the tax state to the debt state when he says, quote, under the post-war tax state, gradual increases in government expenditures were matched by tax revenues, resulting in low levels of public indebtedness. With the emergence of the debt state since the 1970s onward, government expenditures continued to grow while tax revenues stagnated, resulting in escalating levels of public indebtedness. So the question becomes, how does this impact universities? And it's what we want to think through. And who are some of the players impacting the universities? And I think there's two things to point out really quickly. Most people know about the student debt crisis. $1.6 trillion impacts women. As 66% of the debt is held by women, and it's racialized, right? That's not on accident. These are all forms of control if we see it through these lenses. But the other debt crisis, this $300 billion debt crisis, is directly tied to this. And it's tied to this in at least two different ways. So on the one hand, you get university debt trickling down into student debt. In other words, the students are paying more for the loans that the university is taking out because the university is tapping that onto tuition or fees. So this is directly contributing to the amount of student debt that students have. And we have a calculation and a worksheet that you can fill out to figure out how much that is. So it's a really easy worksheet to fill out. I can show it to you later. On the other hand, tuition is collateral for loans. In other words, the university can always tell the creditors that we have a way to guarantee that we'll pay your loan back. And that is, we can raise tuition. And so these two loan types are directly related to each other, and they both contribute to a state of indebtedness that makes us more docile, disciplined, and governable by the powers that be. So I want to just move ahead then and skip ahead to a really important part of this analysis that we often don't hear about. So the players. I'm not going to go into all this, but we need to be aware. So when you think of how does the loan process happen, et cetera, you have some basics here. The borrower, the creditor, the underwriter, and then it's the credit rating agencies that I want to focus on for a little bit. The credit rating agencies have tremendous power. This is from Moody's Investor Service. So basically, Moody's is one of the credit rating agencies, and they issue reports on higher education. And every administration is aware of these reports because you have to make sure that you can get good grades from Moody's. So in the same way that our students want good grades from us, it's no joke. They were both created at the same time. The credit report and the report card emerged out of the early 19th century market revolution. They're both meant to be forms of surveillance, and they demand surveillance. And they both measure and calculate and punish or reward work and credibility. I hate to say it. We are acculturating our students into a debt economy in the classroom through grades and credit. That's a whole other conversation. But the point being here is that Moody's operates on a logic of a report card. And we've seen our credit rating. You get a score, you get a letter grade, right? It's based on certain things that you're going to promise to do and or that you will do. Okay, so what does Moody's look for? Now, this is where this gets really pernicious. So the credit rating that the universities will get will depend on several things. One of which, can the university raise tuition fees? If you can raise tuition and fees, you have a chance for a better credit rating. Another is, can you secure a board of directors with financial expertise? So this is all in the methodology. It's all in black and white. They tell you what you need to have. So if you have a board of trustees with, 40 bankers out of 42 people, that's going to help your credit score.
Great.
Yeah. Can you, quote, take decisive actions to preserve fiscal equilibrium? We all know what that means, right? Can you cut programs? Can you lay off staff? And who would stop you from that? Oh, I wonder. Do you have the ability? Do you have the ability to manage unions and tenure? All of these things impact your credit rating. To give another example from the other education sector, Chicago Teachers Union. Every time Chicago Teachers Union threatens and/or goes on strike, you will see the Chicago Tribune in Chicago sometimes saying Moody's or Fitch threatens Chicago's credit rating because of the strike. In other words, they're worried, the creditors and their allies are worried that if the union brothers and sisters get a better contract, they won't be paying back at the same rate of the $8 billion that Chicago Public Schools owes. So that's really important to keep in mind. So these are just some of the ways that the credit rating agency works. And this is where I want to just give a opening to have a conversation. And really, Afshan, you inspired this conversation with your work on anticipatory obedience. But I do want to think through the ways in which, especially today, the debt economy, debts, credit rating agencies, and other mechanisms are intensifying anticipatory obedience. And the way I want to do this is by first quoting Lisa Atkins, who reminds us that financial instruments are ordering devices. That is, they're not as benign instruments, but as devices that actively intervene in the world. And because securing funds depends on institutions' credit ratings, credit rating agencies operate, as we call it, university shadow governors. So this is in the background. This is a lot of the things that are going on that we often don't hear about. And it's radically undemocratic. How many of you ever been part of a conversation about whether or not your university will take out a loan or not? No one. This is a process that's being determined and dictated without our input. We can't claim shared governance. It's just not the case. Why aren't some of these bond covenants up for public discussion? Why aren't there more hearings about what our budget is being spent on, et cetera? So the idea here is that these credit rating agencies, credit ratings themselves, are part of a surveillance structure. The logic of credit, the logic of debt, means that you always have to obey in advance. You're obeying it in advance to please the creditor and or service your debt in the future that's waiting for you. So it really makes it hard to not be part of this anticipatory obedience when power is able to press this onto you and use these tools or these mechanisms that it's using, like the credit score, like the credit rating. And what we do about that is really a challenge that I think we need to start to think about. And I'll just end by saying, there's a lot more to say about this, but I do want to say this, that I think the neoliberals and their friends, I think they fucked up. It might not sound like it, but I do want you to consider this. As a debt organizer now for over 10 years, since Occupy Wall Street, actually, one of the hardest things to do is to get a bunch of debtors in the same room at the same place to talk about debt. Because debtors are always working to pay off their debts, and or when they come into a room, there's a lot of guilt and shame associated with the debt, and people don't want to talk about it in public. But you know one place where we have a bunch of debtors in our presence every single day? The university. So did they dig their own grave? Like the capitalists supposedly do. Maybe if we can somehow find a way to use debt as an organizing tool on our campuses to say, you're in debt, they're in debt, the staff workers in debt, the professors in debt, the students in debt. What do we do about this debt? And if we can figure out a way, whether it be on the state level right now, because it's probably not going to happen nationally, and eventually at the national level someday, to cancel both individual debt and institutional debt, I think we might move from anticipatory obedience to fuck you, make me. That's all.
Thank you both. Thank you all for coming today and having the conversations that we had today. This was incredible to be here today with all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Round of applause for us.